moment, I was carrying a bag of groceries through the back door, and the next, I was on the laundry room floor, my right ankle twisted underneath me, my hip sending a pain through my body so sharp I couldn't even cry out. I just lay there. The bag had split open when I fell. I remember a can of soup rolling slowly toward the washing machine and thinking, that's going to be hard to reach. I'm 67 years old. I live alone in the house my husband and I bought in 1991, a two-story on a quiet street in Guelph, Ontario. My husband passed 8 years ago. Since then, it's just been me and the house and the garden he loved more than anything. I tried to push myself up. I couldn't. Something in my hip was wrong. Not a pulled muscle wrong, but a grinding, white noise kind of wrong that told me this was serious. I had my phone in my coat pocket. That was the only lucky thing about that afternoon. I called my son first. He didn't answer. I called him again. Still nothing. I called my daughter-in-law. Nothing. I lay on that floor for nearly 50 minutes before I called 911. I kept thinking one of them would call back. They didn't. The paramedics were kind. They were young. One of them couldn't have been more than 24. And they talked to me the whole time, telling me what they were doing, making sure I wasn't scared. I was scared. But I didn't tell them that. I just kept asking if someone had reached my son. They said they'd tried the emergency contact on my health card. No answer. At the hospital, they told me I'd fractured my hip. I'd need surgery. The nurse at admissions, a no-nonsense woman named after a month of the year. I remember that. She told me they keep trying my emergency contact. I told her to try my son's number and his wife's number both. She wrote them down. I went into surgery that evening. I don't know exactly how many times they called. What I know is what the nurse told me the next morning when I woke up in the recovery ward. They had tried my son's number 14 times and his wife's number 9 times over the course of the evening. 23 calls. No one answered. No one called back. He knew. That part I need you to understand. He wasn't unreachable because of an emergency of his own. He wasn't in a tunnel or in a meeting or somewhere without service. I know this because of what I found out 3 days later when a friend of mine, a woman I've known since our kids were in elementary school together, she lives 2 streets over, she came to see me in the hospital and she said, very carefully, the way you say something when you're not sure how it's going to land? Lorraine. I saw on Facebook that Trevor and Sasha were away this weekend, up at the cottage. I looked at her. I thought you should know, she said. In case you didn't. I didn't. Trevor is my son. He's 41 years old. He and his wife Sasha have had the same cottage on Lake Huron for 6 years. They bought it the same year I lent them $40,000 for a down payment on their house in Kitchener. I don't say that to keep score. I say it because it matters to the rest of the story. So while I was being put under general anesthesia, while a surgeon was repairing my fractured hip, while nurses were trying to reach my emergency contact over and over and over, my son and his daughter-in-law were at the cottage, on the lake, unreachable by choice. After my friend left, I lay there for a long time looking at the ceiling. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I'm not sure why I didn't cry. Maybe I wasn't surprised enough. Maybe some part of me had been preparing for this moment for longer than I'd admitted to myself. When Trevor finally called, 4 days after my surgery, 4 days after 23 unanswered calls, he opened with, "Mom, I just heard, I'm so sorry, how are you doing?" As if he'd heard through the grapevine, as if it had just reached him somehow. This news, floating through the air, his voice had that careful quality it gets when he knows he's done something wrong. Measured, rehearsed. I said, "The hospital called you 23 times. Silence. Trevor, they called your number 14 times and Sasha's 9 times while I was in surgery. More silence. And then, Mom, we were up north. The service up there is. You posted a photo on Saturday morning," I said. "At the Tim Hortons in Goderich." That's 40 minutes from the cottage. You had full service." He didn't answer that. I want to tell you about the weeks before I fell, because they matter. 6 weeks earlier, Trevor had come to the house for dinner, just him without Sasha, which was unusual. And he'd brought up, almost casually, the idea of me simplifying. That was the word he used. Simplifying. The house was getting to be a lot for one person, he said. Had I thought about maybe downsizing? There were some lovely condo developments going up near the university. Or, and here he paused, there was always the option of moving in with them. They had the extra room. I told him I was fine. The house was paid off. I had my pension from 31 years with the provincial government. I had my RRSP, and I had my health. I wasn't ready to simplify anything. He brought it up twice more after that. Once on the phone, once in a text message that I read and didn't respond to right away. Now, I was lying in a hospital bed with a repaired hip, and I had time, more time than I wanted, to think about the timing of things. I didn't say any of this to Trevor on the phone. I just told him I was fine, that the surgery had gone well, and that I'd call him when I was discharged. He said he'd come to see me. He didn't come to see me. Sasha texted a week and a half after my surgery. One text. It said, "Hey Lorraine, Trevor mentioned you had a fall. Hope you're feeling better soon. Let us know if you need anything." An emoji at the end. The one with the little folded hands. I have a sister who lives in Winnipeg. She booked a flight the morning after she heard what happened and was at the hospital within 30 hours. Her name is Audrey. She's 64 and she took 2 weeks off work. She still works part-time at a medical clinic to come and stay with me when I was discharged. She slept in the guest room and made soup and drove me to my follow-up appointments and sat with me in the evenings without either of us needing to say very much. My son lives 90 minutes away and didn't visit. The day before Audrey was supposed to fly back to Winnipeg, she sat down with me at the kitchen table and she said, "I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me." I told her to go ahead. She said, "Is your will still the way it was when you made it? After Gerald died?" My husband's name was Gerald. He died 8 years ago. The will I'd made with him left everything to Trevor, the house, the savings, everything. It hadn't occurred to me to change it. It had never needed to occur to me. I told Audrey it was the same. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, that's what I thought. I just wanted to know." She didn't push it further. She wasn't like that. But the question stayed with me after she left. It stayed with me through the rest of my recovery, through the weeks of physiotherapy at a clinic on Woolwich Street, through the slow process of learning to walk without a limp again. I started thinking about things I hadn't let myself think about. Gerald had handled most of our finances when he was alive, not because I couldn't, but because he'd wanted to, and I'd let him. After he died, I'd taken it all over and discovered I understood it better than I'd expected. I went through our accounts, updated our investment portfolios, learned what I needed to learn. I was good at it. What I hadn't done was reconsider who the beneficiary of all of it would be. I called my financial advisor. I asked him to walk me through everything: the house's current value, the RRSPs, the savings accounts, the small life insurance policy that was still active. He went through it all with me. It came to more than I'd let myself consciously add up. Significantly more. I thought about Trevor asking me if I'd thought about simplifying. I thought about 23 unanswered calls. I thought about one text message with a folded hands emoji. I called a lawyer. Not the one Trevor and I had used together for some property matter years ago, a different one, a woman whose name I found through the Law Society of Ontario's directory, whose office was in downtown Guelph, and whose reviews said she was thorough and direct. Her name was Beverly, not Beverly, Beverly. And she had short gray hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain. And she didn't waste either of our time. I told her I wanted to update my will. I told her I wanted to understand all my options. She explained everything clearly. A will in Ontario only takes effect after death. Until then, my assets were entirely mine under my control. I could change my beneficiaries as many times as I wanted. I could sell the house and do whatever I liked with the proceeds. I could set up a trust. I could name anyone or any organization I wanted. I did not have to leave anything to anyone. I did not choose to leave it to. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I told her what I wanted to do. The house went on the market in September, 3 months after my surgery. My real estate agent, a man I'd worked with once before, when Gerald and I had briefly considered moving after he retired, had the listing up within a week. The market in Guelph had cooled a little from its peak, but the house was well maintained and on a good street, and we had an accepted offer within 3 weeks. It sold for just over what we paid for it in 1991, times 4. I found a ground floor condo near the river. Everything on one level, no stairs, wide doorways, a small patio for container gardening. I could look out at the Speed River in the morning while I had my coffee. It was smaller than the house, which surprised me with how little that bothered me. Trevor didn't know about any of it until the for sale sign went up. He called the evening he saw it, not because I told him, but because apparently someone he knows in the neighborhood had mentioned it. His voice, when I answered, was different from the careful, measured voice I'd heard after my surgery. This was faster, less rehearsed. "Mom, what's going on? Why is the house listed?" I told him I was selling. I told him I was moving to a condo near the river. "Why didn't you? When did you decide this? Why didn't you talk to me?" I said, "I've made my decision." "But Mom, this is the family house. Dad built the deck on this house. I grew up in this house. Don't you think—" "Trevor?" I said, "the hospital called you 23 times. He went quiet. "I was in surgery," I said. "I was alone. And for 3 months I've been asking myself what that means, and I think I know now." He tried. I'll give him that. Over the following weeks he tried several different approaches. He came to the house, once, and sat in the kitchen and told me he was sorry, that he should have had his phone on, that he felt terrible about it. He looked like he expected me to fill in the rest of the space. I didn't. I let his apology sit there between us. Sasha called me once. That surprised me. She said all the right things, that they'd both been thoughtless, that they could see how much they'd hurt me, that they wanted to make it right. She asked if there was anything they could do. I said I appreciated the call. I meant it, actually. But an apology, I've learned, is information. It tells you what someone will do when they're scared of consequences. It doesn't tell you what they'll do next time. Nothing is at stake. I updated my will in October. Audrey is now the primary beneficiary, not all of it. I've set aside some for a bursary at the university, for students in public administration, which was the field I worked in for 31 years, and which nobody seems to want to study anymore. A small amount for a couple of charities Gerald used to donate to, the rest to Audrey. I haven't told Trevor. I moved into the condo in November. Audrey flew back out to help me move. Not the heavy lifting, we hired people for that, but to be there, to have dinner with me the first night in the new place, at a folding table with wine in paper cups, because I hadn't unpacked the good glasses yet. My son sent a text when he found out I'd moved. It said, "Hope the new place is good, Mom. Let me know when you're settled and maybe we can come for a visit." I haven't answered it yet. I'm still deciding what I want to say, or whether I want to say anything. I want to talk about something that people don't say out loud very often. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with this. Not the grief of a death. I know what that feels like. I spent a year learning what it felt like after Gerald. But a slower, stranger grief. The grief of understanding that the person you thought you had isn't quite the person who's actually there. I loved my son when he was small. I loved him completely and without condition, the way you do. I drove him to hockey at 6 in the morning for 11 years. I sat at the back of every school concert. I flew out when he proposed to Sasha to celebrate with them. I put $40,000 into a bank account with his name on it because I wanted him to have a good start. I don't regret any of it. That's all true and all real. And also true and all real. He was at the cottage when I was in surgery. He made a choice about what mattered. He made it without knowing he was making it, which is actually the most telling kind of choice. The ones you make without thinking are the ones that show you who you are. I don't hate my son. I want to be careful about that because I don't want to be misunderstood. This isn't a story about hate. It's a story about clarity, about a woman who needed to fall down on her laundry room floor before she could see clearly what had been in front of her for years. I had been managing my grief about Trevor for a long time, his absence, his distance, the calls that came less and less often, the Christmas visits that became briefer and then stopped being overnights and then became just dinner and then became dinner with an early drive back. I managed it by explaining it. He's busy. They're building their lives. It's different for this generation. They don't feel the same pull to home that we did. But that's not quite it, is it? It's not a generational thing. My sister's son calls her twice a week. He's 38. He lives in Calgary. He flew out to see her when she had a minor health scare last spring, a scare that turned out to be nothing. He still flew out. What I've come to believe is this. Some people have the capacity for it, and some people have let it go without quite realizing they've let it go without quite realizing they've let it go. And you can grieve that and still take care of yourself. Both things can be true. The condo is warm. The river outside is frozen now, a pale, flat white in the winter light. I've learned the names of my neighbors, a retired couple on the east side who have a dog and are always out early, a woman about my age to the west who works nights and sleeps until noon and waves at me from the parking lot in the afternoons. Small things. The beginning of a life. Audrey calls every Sunday. She always has, she always will. There are people in your life who will answer. You may have to look a little more carefully for them than you expected. You may find them in places that surprised you, a sister 2 provinces away, a friend 2 streets over, a young paramedic talking you through something frightening with more kindness than your own blood managed. But they're there. What I want to say to you, if you're listening to this and something in it sounds familiar, is that you are not obligated to keep making space for people who have decided, quietly and without ceremony, that you are not their priority. You are allowed to update the will. You are allowed to sell the house. You are allowed to move toward the people who show up, and let the ones who don't show up live with the choices they've made. I'm 67 years old. I have a condo by the river. I have a sister who flew across the country without being asked. I have a hip that aches a little in cold weather and a patio where I'm planning a container garden in the spring. It's not the life I planned. It's the one I chose, finally, for myself. And that turns out to be enough. There's a can of soup somewhere in this story that I keep coming back to. The one that rolled across the laundry room floor while I was lying there unable to move. I remember watching it and thinking about how ordinary it was. Just a can of tomato soup going where gravity took it, while everything else in my life was quietly becoming something I hadn't expected. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that afternoon. Not in any mystical sense, just in the plain, practical way that you do when you've had enough time and enough quiet to look back clearly. Trevor didn't make one bad choice. He made a long series of small ones. The calls he didn't return, the visits that got shorter, the conversations about my house that were really conversations about something else entirely. Each one barely noticeable on its own. Together they added up to 23 unanswered calls. And I made my own long series of choices too. I explained things away. I gave the benefit of the doubt, past the point where doubt deserved the benefit. I told myself a story about a busy son building his life, because the alternative story was one I wasn't ready to read yet. That's not self-pity, it's just honesty. I wasn't paying attention the way I should have been. That was on me. What changed after the surgery wasn't that I became angry, it was that I became clear. There's a real difference between those two things, and I think it matters. Anger is loud, and it burns through quickly, and sometimes it makes you do things you regret. Clarity is quieter. It sits with you. It lets you look at a situation from every angle before you decide what to do about it. Clarity is what let me sit across from a lawyer named Beverly and say exactly what I wanted. Calmly, without drama, without revenge in my heart. Just with a straightforward understanding of what was mine and what I was choosing to do with it. I didn't update my will to punish Trevor. I want to be honest about that because I think it's important. I did it because it finally reflected the truth of my life. Who had actually shown up, who had actually stayed. Audrey flew across the country without being asked. That's not a small thing. That's a person telling you, through action rather than words, exactly where you stand with them. I had just never thought to ask myself why I'd been treating the person who showed up the same as the person who didn't. That's the part I keep turning over. How long I'd let good intentions substitute for presence. How long I'd accepted the idea of being cared for instead of the actual experience of it. There's a kind of wisdom that only arrives after you've been forced to be still, lying on a floor, lying in a hospital bed, sitting alone in a house you're about to sell. That shows you clearly what you actually have versus what you assumed you had. I'm 67. I have a patio and a river view and a sister who calls on Sundays. I made hard decisions not because I was brave, exactly, but because I finally understood that staying in a story that wasn't true anymore was its own kind of harm. You owe it to yourself, and I genuinely believe this, to update the story when the facts change. That's not hardness. That's good sense. That's taking care of the one person who is always going to be there no matter what, yourself. The cottage will still be there next summer. Trevor will be fine. And I'll be here, by the river, starting over in the only way that counts, with open eyes.